Here on BBC One in 40 minutes, Britain's religious leaders call for a time of reflection. First, we hand back to the news now with Peter Sissons.
Good evening. The body of Diana, Princess of Wales, is lying tonight in a private chapel of rest in London. Her close friend, Dodi Fayed, is being buried in a Muslim cemetery on the outskirts of the capital. And all less than 24 hours after, by all accounts, one of the happiest evenings they'd spent together. And around the wreckage of their lives is already running a bitter debate about what part in her death was really played by the squad of determined photographers who dogged her every step until it all unravelled in the horror of a high-speed crash in a Paris underpass. At 7 o'clock this evening, an RAF plane brought her home for the last time. Brian Hanrahan was at RAF Northolt in West London when it arrived.
The Princess's body was brought home with royal ceremonial. A BA 146 of the Royal Squadron landed at RAF Northolt into the setting sun. Waiting to receive it were the Prime Minister and the Defence Secretary. The procedure used was drawn up years ago in the event of a death of a member of the royal family abroad, but not used until today. Aboard the plane were Prince Charles and the Princess's two sisters, who'd flown to Paris to escort her body home. The coffin, draped in the standard of the royal family, was carried from the plane by members of the Queen's Squadron of the RAF Regiment. It was a silent ceremony, no drums, no bands, no speeches. Prince Charles and her two sisters, Lady Jane Fellows and Lady Sarah McCorquodale, stood on the blustery tarmac as the coffin was placed in a hearse, with a single family wreath on top. Flowers from other members of the family, including those from the Prince of Wales, were placed alongside it. Afterwards, the mourners parted, the two sisters continuing with the coffin to a private mortuary in London. Prince Charles stayed to fly back to Balmoral to join their two sons. The ceremony inside RAF Northolt was private, attended only by official guests. But outside, thousands waited along the route into London. There'll be much pressure for public mourning for the princess who captured many hearts, and in her sudden, unexpected death continues to attract great public attention. Brian Hanrahan, BBC News, RAF Northolt.
In the last hours of her life, Diana had dined with the new love in her life, Dodi Fayed. But within minutes, a horrific crash ended the dream, leaving him and their driver dead and the princess fatally injured. As the battle to save her life was lost and the reality of her passing hit home, the wave of shock and grief touched many around the world. Our chief news correspondent, Kate Adey, reports from Paris.
The crash was at high speed and horrific. Just after midnight, the black Mercedes hit the curb, cannoned into a concrete pillar of an underpass, then bounced into the side wall. The French authorities say the driver had lost control and was going at twice, possibly 3 times the speed limit. The impact killed Dodi Al-Fayed immediately and his driver. The princess and her British bodyguard had to be cut from the wreckage. The emergency services arrived quickly and were reportedly appalled at the scene. It took over an hour to free the princess, during which time she received emergency treatment. First reports had described her as having arm and thigh injuries and concussion. She was taken to La Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital, and at that time the gravity of her condition was not publicly known. She had massive chest injuries and suffered a heart attack shortly after arrival.
Malgré la fermeture de cette plaie et un massage cardiaque externe.
For 2 hours, the doctors had tried desperately to save her, but despite their efforts, she died at 4 in the morning. By then, the royal family and both British and French governments had been informed of the situation. The French Prime Minister led his country's tributes.
Je sais que les Français ont toujours été séduits par son charme.
The French people were captivated by her charm, humanity and personality. We of course express our condolences to our friends of the United Kingdom.
As the news spread, the British ambassador added his words.
The death of the Princess of Wales fills us all with deep shock and with deep grief. And our thoughts and our prayers are with her family and her friends, and with the family and friends of the others who died in the accident.
The Princess of Wales and Dodi Al-Fayed had begun their evening with dinner at the Ritz Hotel. Photographers, the persistent paparazzi, were outside. So the Mercedes driver, with the bodyguard in the front, collected the couple at a rear entrance, then headed towards a villa owned by the Fayed family across the river. 7 photographers set off in pursuit on motorcycles. There are several witnesses to the chase, and the 7 photographers are now in police custody, some apparently having taken pictures of the crash. The main witness will be Trevor Rhys-Jones, the bodyguard, who has injuries to his head and lungs. The site of the accident is a mundane traffic tunnel in the centre of the city. For those who have come to look, there is very little to convey what happened here. Perhaps this has added to the sense of disbelief and shock that is very evident. All day there has been a constant stream to the spot. Tourists, Parisians, travellers, French citizens, Japanese students, American soldiers, British holidaymakers. Most could not find words enough to express their feelings. The messages with the flowers were in many languages. From the roadside spot, ripples of grief spread wide. And amid the emotion, the journey home had to be prepared. The French President, Monsieur Chirac, greeting Prince Charles, who'd arrived at the hospital in the late afternoon. A short time later, with a French honour guard in attendance, the coffin of Diana, Princess of Wales, was borne from the hospital, followed by the Prince of Wales and the sisters of the Princess, Jane and Sarah. At a quiet military airport west of Paris, the RAF took over. A slow progress to an aircraft of the Queen's flight. And a few flowers for the journey. There is shock in France and rage at the circumstances of the accident, and there is sadness. Kate Adey, BBC News, Paris.
Hundreds of people are tonight holding candlelit vigils outside Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace, the Princess's London home. And there have been special church services to remember Diana and those who died with her. David Loyne reports on the death that left so many stunned.
Tonight, Kensington Palace, the London home of the Princess of Wales, was the focus of the nation's grief. Wave upon wave of flowers piled as high as they could go. This morning, even by the time they came to change the guard at Buckingham Palace, a more sombre affair than usual, the pavement outside was already a sea of flowers. Diana knew she would never live here as queen, but there was real emotion, perhaps fulfilling her hope that she would be queen in people's hearts.
Everybody loves Diana.
I think she's someone that every young woman probably wanted to be. She was a wonderful person, beautiful. She was just a lovely person. We all hoped that we could be like her.
I just heard that she died, and I was so upset, and I cried a lot.
In St Paul's Cathedral, as in churches up and down the land, there were special prayers of remembrance, with added poignancy here, where the marriage began 16 years ago.
Many of us recall the Archbishop of Canterbury saying at that service, "This is the stuff of which fairy tales are made." But as the story unfolded, as the tale was told, there was a dimension of tragedy.
Religious leaders are still trying to make sense of the way Diana's life was cut short so dramatically.
She had a faith in God, although she wasn't the kind of person who wore religion on her sleeves. There was a deep faith there going on. And her relationship with Mother Teresa, for example, was one of the she spoke to me about. So we cope, I think, by holding on to the things that she believed in.
I think in many ways she had quite a lot of sadness in her life, but she will be remembered by the very considerable amount of good which she did. And I'm thinking not only recently on the question of landmines, but on the question also of the homeless, especially the young homeless.
Diana's relationship with Dodi Fayed, the heir to the owner of Harrods, was her most serious since her marriage broke down. A spokesman for the family said it would have lasted.
I happened to speak to Dodi before he went back to Los Angeles to deal with a piece of legal business which now is pathetically irrelevant. And I said to him, if you go to the studio and you go to the canteen or commissary and you have a cup of coffee with a girl, the papers will say you've got a new girlfriend. And he turned to me and he said, I will never, ever have another girlfriend. And he said it in such a way. He never raised his voice, but he said it in such a determined way that I knew he was absolutely sincere.
In the Muslim tradition, Dodi Fayed's funeral service was held on the day of his death at Regent's Park Mosque in London. His body was then taken to a Muslim cemetery near Woking for burial in the country which had never allowed his father to become a citizen. While on the other side of London, thousands of people continue to mill around Buckingham Palace, mourning the people's princess in their own way, whatever final form national mourning might take. David Loyne, BBC News.
And Margaret Gilmore is outside Kensington Palace. Margaret, can you describe the scene there now?
Well, picking up on what Dave Loyne just said, very much a sign that she was the people's princess. There are people here from every walk of life, every age, every race, and despite the time of night, still streaming into the park here. It's quite incredible. Very peaceful, very quiet. A few minutes ago, I walked along the wall that goes from the road all the way up to the palace. It's about 400 yards, and every inch of the way there are people praying, still little children at this time of night, people laying flowers, people keeping vigil, candles. It's almost like a shrine all the way along, and this all-pervading smell still of roses, of irises, and of scented candles now. It's quite incredible. People from all over the country who've been coming here, and as I say, still streaming into the park. People from Scotland, people from Wales, people from the Midlands, even one person earlier who said that he lived in Amsterdam and he just got on a plane this morning because he felt he had to come here. Earlier we had delegations from the Red Cross who benefited so much from her work with landmines. They came, a small delegation, a volunteer in her uniform, 2 other people, and they laid some red roses. But a little bit of aggression earlier towards the press, off and on, but in the main, very quiet, very peaceful, and a real sense of mourning, a sense that the ordinary people feel that she was very much one of them, and that this is their place to come to mourn her at the moment until they hear what other arrangements are going to be made.
Well, Margaret, what no one knows tonight is what the funeral arrangements are. When will we know?
Well, that's right. Buckingham Palace had been hoping to make an announcement tonight. It's thought that they really do want to make a real effort to get in touch with her family and to hear exactly what their views are. We are expecting the palace to make an announcement on that tomorrow, and a lot of people here, just ordinary people, are waiting to hear about that too, because they have feelings on what type of funeral they would like to see.
Well, what sort of funeral? Have you been able to gauge what sort of thing they'd be happy with? Would they be happy with being kept at arm's length if it's a relatively private event?
Well, the people here, I don't think would be. These are people, obviously the people coming here, people who feel strongly enough and emotionally drawn towards the princess enough to actually come here and pay respects and spend time here and think about her and weep, a lot of them weeping only. And to a T, every single one that I've been asking this evening have said they want a big public funeral. They want a funeral they have access to. They can see the funeral, they can see what's going on. They want her buried somewhere where they can visit the grave. They want a big place where the public can mourn in a big way. They want it in a cathedral, and they want access to it, and they do not want her kept under wraps, as long as that's the wishes of the family, but they want access. They don't want it to be taken away from them. They feel very strongly that she was one of them, and that maybe things weren't so good for her in parts of her life, and they want to show that she was very much loved by a huge part of the nation.
Margaret Gilmore at Kensington Palace, thank you. Before meeting the plane bringing Diana's body back to RAF Northolt tonight, the Prime Minister led the tributes from politicians. He described Diana as a wonderful and warm human being who had touched the lives of so many in Britain and throughout the world with joy and comfort. Mr. Blair said he was utterly devastated by her death. Our political editor Robin Oakley reports on the reaction in the world of politics.
The grieving royal family went to church as usual this morning near Balmoral, Prince Charles having told his sons of their mother's death earlier. Politicians united in their sympathy and in shock at the loss of a princess whose charm and campaigning compassion many of them had encountered at first hand. In his Sedgefield constituency, the Prime Minister, whose young family had met the princess and her children recently, paid an emotional tribute to her qualities.
Our thoughts and prayers are with Princess Diana's family, in particular her two sons, the two boys. Our hearts go out to them. We are today a nation in Britain in a state of shock, in mourning, in grief that is so deeply painful for us. She was a wonderful and a warm human being. Though her own life was often sadly touched by tragedy, she touched the lives of so many others in Britain throughout the world with joy and with comfort.
Normal political hostilities ground to a halt, and as Prince Charles left from Aberdeen to fly to Paris and collect his former wife's body, the government confirmed that campaigning on the Scottish Parliament referendum would be suspended. Other party leaders paid their own tributes.
I want to express on behalf of my party and on behalf of my constituents here in Yorkshire our sadness and terrible shock in the news overnight. It has come as a great shock to everybody waking up this morning, and a great sadness to all of us, and of course we're all thinking about Prince William and Prince Harry and the other members of the family of the princess. She was a unique and very lively and attractive individual, and so people will feel a personal sense of loss. But of course we should also pay tribute today to the tremendous work that she did.
Our thoughts and our prayers and our first considerations must be for her family, the Prince of Wales, her wider family. Beyond that, she brought light and compassion to our life and much else as well, and that light has now gone out.
As flags flew at half-mast in Whitehall, the only note of controversy struck was over what, if anything, could be done to restrict the sort of media intrusion being blamed for the princess's death. Politicians of all parties have been united today in simple personal grief for the loss of the woman whom the Prime Minister called the People's Princess, and in sympathy for two young princes left without a mother. but they're expecting an anti-media backlash with the demand for new privacy laws to curb intrusion. It could yet test ministers' view that media self-regulation is the least worst option. Robin Oakley, BBC News, Downing Street.
Well, tonight, Margaret Gilmore referred to a small amount of hostility towards the media outside Kensington Palace. But earlier, the Princess's brother, Earl Spencer, went much further. He blamed the behaviour of the media for his sister's death. He accused newspaper editors who'd bought what he called intrusive pictures of the Princess of having blood on their hands. The tragedies led to calls for tougher action against the press. Here's our media correspondent, Nick Hyam.
These were the motorbikes seized by Paris police, apparently used by freelance photographers or paparazzi following Princess Diana's car. The suggestion that the paparazzi may have caused the princess's death incensed many. There were angry scenes outside Buckingham Palace aimed at journalists and newspapers.
They killed Diana.
Commercial journalists and commercial journalists.
They killed Diana.
The most outspoken condemnation came from the princess's brother in South Africa.
This is not a time for recriminations, but for sadness. However, I would say that I always believed the press would kill her in the end. But not even I could imagine that they would take such a direct hand in her death, as seems to be the case. It would appear that every proprietor and editor of every publication that has paid for intrusive and exploitative photographs of her, encouraging greedy and ruthless individuals to risk everything in pursuit of Diana's image, has blood on his hands today.
From the moment her relationship with the heir to the throne became public, the young Diana Spencer found herself pursued by photographers in the street. It was something she always hated.
I never know where a lens is going to be. A normal day would be followed by 4 cars. A normal day would come back to my car and find 6 freelance photographers jumping around me. Some people would say, well, if you had a policeman, it'd make it easier. It doesn't at all. They've decided that I'm still a project after 15, 16 years that sells well.
Last night, newspapers, including this one, were offered pictures of the princess lying in the car for £200,000. They didn't buy. Now there are calls for newspapers not to deal with the paparazzi in future.
All newspapers need to say that they will not publish these paparazzi photographs because these chaps are doing this not for their family albums, but for money, huge sums of money. And it may be if that fails, the government will have to consider ways of preventing those kind of intrusive photographers, that kind of harassment. And that is quite different, let's be clear about this, from a privacy law.
The paparazzi chase celebrities of all kinds. Here, photographers on motorcycles pursue France's President Chirac, even though France has strict privacy laws. One photographer says the paparazzi can't be stopped.
What are you going to do? You can't introduce a privacy law in this country. This didn't happen in this country, it happened in France. France has got the tightest privacy laws in the world. You're just not going to stop this sort of thing happening. The paparazzi know. London isn't the market, Paris isn't the market, the world is the market.
The press believes it's being unfairly blamed for the activities of freelancers. Newspapers say there's no need for tighter controls.
She had a really unique relationship with the public, and the media were the way many times she communicated with the public. She had a place in the hearts of the public, and I don't think we'll see that same press attention for another person really again.
Tabloid newspaper editors have been keeping their heads down today amid the calls for greater self-restraint and renewed talk of privacy laws. But privately, one told me the press was being judged before full details of the accident were known, and he agreed with other editors who say privacy laws, which limit what can be published, are no solution to the problem of harassment by photographers on the ground. The princess has become an icon of beauty and glamour. Now the newspapers who fed her popularity may find popular opinion has turned against them, forcing them to act. Nick Hyam, BBC News.
And Nick Hyam, along with our court correspondent Jenny Bond, will be answering your questions about the issues surrounding Diana's death on an extended breakfast news tomorrow morning. They'll be on at 9:30. The number to call is 01818 811 1000, and the lines are already open. Throughout the day, leaders and statesmen from around the world have paid tribute to the princess. The Russian President Boris Yeltsin said Princess Diana was well known and loved by the Russians. Everyone knew about her major contribution to charitable actions in and beyond Britain. The South African President Nelson Mandela also paid tribute. He said the Princess had been a great ambassador for Britain.
I had the honor of hosting her a few months ago when she visited our country. And I was tremendously impressed by her. She was undoubtedly one of the best ambassadors of Great Britain.
And Mother Teresa of Calcutta spoke of Diana's deep desire to help the sick and the poor.
She had great love for the poor. She was very often anxious to help me to come to know a little more about the poor. She was very, very, only because she had such a position, so she could not actually come and work with us.
President Clinton has said he'll be writing to the royal family, the Prime Minister and to the Princess's brother to express his condolences. He interrupted his holiday to speak of his profound sadness at her death and to say how much he liked and admired her. Our Washington correspondent Bridget Kendall reports on the impact Diana made across the United States.
Outside the British Embassy in Washington, a steady stream of Princess Diana's many followers in America come to pay tribute. It was the middle of the night when her death was first confirmed, and the first to come left lighted candles. Others marked their affection and grief with cards and even a poem. President Clinton was with his wife on an island off Massachusetts when he heard the news last night at a private party. This morning, breaking away from his holiday, on behalf of fellow Americans, he expressed his condolences to the people of the United Kingdom.
We liked her very much. We admired her work for children, for people with AIDS, for the cause of ending the scourge of landmines in the world, and for her love for her children, William and Harry. And I know that this is a very difficult time for millions of people in the United Kingdom who are deeply shocked and grieving. And the American people send their condolences to all of them.
Perhaps nowhere more than in the United States did the Princess of Wales capture the public's imagination. From her first visit as the young bride of the Prince of Wales, she quickly won celebrity status, the star of the show at President Reagan's White House when she danced with John Travolta. But it wasn't just her photogenic looks and stylish clothes that won her an adoring American public. Her work with children and the disadvantaged meant she was particularly welcome at the Clinton White House, guest of honour at a breakfast hosted by the First Lady last September, who called her one of the nicest British invasions.
She would send shivers down the spine of professional diplomats because, in a sense, she was not controllable. She was not good at delivering formal messages. But conveying an image of a Britain that cared and of a Britain that was relevant to a huge range of human concerns, I thought she was spectacular.
Today, news of her death has dominated news reports across the country, and nowhere more than in the centre of New York, a city where she was always greeted with enthusiasm.
She particularly liked New York City. She enjoyed coming here, and I think New Yorkers particularly loved her because of this caring and compassion that she had for people. The circumstances of her death, no matter what they would have been tragic. From everything that we can tell, it's even more tragic that she died in this way.
Here in the nation's capital, the mood has also been one of shock and bewilderment. She wasn't afraid to reach out to people, was how one woman put it. We're all going to miss her. For a country that delights in informality, she was the perfect 20th century princess. Bridget Kendall, BBC News, Washington.
Here, charities supported by the Princess said it will be impossible to find a replacement for the hard-working, dedicated campaigner she had become. In recent years, the Princess had chosen to concentrate her efforts on a relatively few causes, including the homeless and AIDS sufferers. As our social affairs editor Neil Dixon reports, she'd also travelled extensively, campaigning for a worldwide ban on landmines.
Behind the formal meetings and greetings, Diana, Princess of Wales, brought compassion and understanding to her work with the deprived and the suffering. Her contribution was always much more than that of a high-profile celebrity.
I'm not a political animal, but I think the biggest disease this world suffers from in this day and age is the disease of people feeling unloved. And I know that I can give love for a minute, for half an hour, for a day, for a month, but I can give, and I'm very happy to do that, and I want to do that.
Perhaps more than any other charitable patron, she made a difference, being prepared to defy prejudice, as in this meeting with AIDS patients in America. Indeed, her famous handshake with an AIDS patient at the Middlesex Hospital in 1987, she single-handedly changed attitudes both here and around the world. It was a concern she maintained throughout her life. She was planning to visit the AIDS charity London Lighthouse later this month.
It would have been a private visit. It would never have got into the papers or onto the television. But she was just going to come and bring a friend who was interested in Lighthouse and sit and talk to some of our service users and staff. And that kind of personal interest is really irreplaceable.
But the relentless media glare, even in this area of her life, took its toll. And following her separation from Prince Charles, she announced she would be scaling down her charitable work.
Over the next few months, I will be seeking a more suitable way of combining a meaningful public role with, hopefully, a more private life.
But the woman who wanted to be known as the Queen of Hearts continued to devote herself to her favourite causes. She brought more than publicity. For someone who is naturally shy, she became adept at putting others at ease.
If you'd seen her walking into a room with a number of old people all around, and she would pick out probably the oldest person in the room, and probably in a way, to our eyes, to camera's eyes, almost the least attractive, and she would go there, the hand would be into that older hand, and she would form a link that no other person in my experience has been able to do.
And she continued to highlight the plight of those who would otherwise be forgotten. When she went to Angola, crusading for a ban on landmines, she courted political controversy and put herself at some risk. Campaigners who'd been trying for years to get something done found governments began to notice at last.
And it wasn't until the Princess became involved at the end of '96 and early '97 with the Angola trip and with a number of other things that suddenly everybody woke up to this problem. And millions of people around the world have now seen her talking about this issue.
As one charity leader put it today, Diana, Princess of Wales, made a genuine difference to people's lives, using her public position and the media to create hope out of despair, and leaving even the most distressed with a sense that someone cared. Neil Dixon, BBC News.
Diana, Princess of Wales, became a member of the royal family through marriage and lost the title Her Royal Highness with her divorce. But it was a quality within herself that enabled her to transcend the usual boundaries of fame, to become a star, perhaps even an icon. John Simpson analyses the quality which led the French President Jacques Chirac today to call Diana a woman of our age.
She wasn't just a star of our time, she was the star of our time. The most famous woman in the world, bar none. Her image, whether as a princess or a queen of fashion, or the heroine of a universal soap opera, or someone who befriended the poor and sick, was known in every single country in the world. As for the cameras, they could never take their eyes off her. At first, back in 1980, the fascination was merely to get a sight of the shy young woman who was going to marry the heir to the throne. She was gawky, and the contrast with the later fashion icon was total. Those were innocent days, comparatively. Even so, a picture of her in a see-through dress was enough to send the tabloids into a frenzy. It was very hard for a young woman of the 80s, a commoner, to fit into the tight restrictions the royal family were obliged to impose on themselves. She had to be young because the future queen couldn't turn up to have a past. Her husband-to-be did have a past, and it came to haunt their marriage. Maybe with hindsight, the signs were already there.
And I'm amazed that she's been brave enough to take me on. And I suppose in love.
Of course.
Whatever in love means. So.
But the fairy tale was still in place. Their wedding was the most lavish and spectacular ever, and the princess caught precisely the mood and fashion of the time in her hairstyle, her dress, her whole appearance. It was the effective start of her reign as a queen of fashion. There wouldn't be too many days as happy as this. Even their honeymoon wasn't entirely happy, partly thanks to all the media attention. Later, both Prince and Princess agreed in different ways that some of the problem lay in her age. To have so much responsibility and to get so much attention so young wasn't easy. And while the rest of the royal family seemed to endure public attention, she courted it. Her smile, a combination of the shy, the alluring and even the coquettish, guaranteed attention worldwide. Now the prince was taking second place to the first star the royal family had known since Edward VIII. It began to create divisions between the princess and court officials. A damaging rivalry was beginning.
It's only bad luck having to face all this, isn't it?
The birth of her children, far from mending the marriage, brought new problems. Afterwards, the princess suffered bouts of depression, suicidal impulses, bulimia. According to her account later, she got no help from the official hierarchy at Buckingham Palace. She remained an outsider. It was a turning point. She did with her life what she had previously done with her appearance. She reinvented herself, finding a new compassion and seriousness. With AIDS patients, her beauty and sympathy made a profound impression. But everything had changed within her marriage too. And on a trip to South Korea, the distance between the couple was self-evident. The rumours were backed up by stories which the tabloids bought from friends, servants and snoopers. And when they were in India, the princess, as conscious as ever of the cameras, insisted on posing alone for them at the Taj Mahal. We could all guess it for ourselves. The marriage was over. By now, it was open warfare. Andrew Morton's book, written with the help of the princess's friends and with her agreement, confirmed the rumours and more. News of the separation came in December 1992.
It is announced from Buckingham Palace that, with regret, the Prince and Princess of Wales have decided to separate. Their Royal Highnesses have no plans to divorce, and their constitutional positions are unaffected.
But it didn't halt the damage to the royal family. On the contrary, there was a new war of style. Without her, the prince was increasingly regarded by public opinion as stodgy, and the royal family as being out of touch. By contrast, the princess was encouraging the royal children to be classless, relaxed, children of the 90s. She seemed to dominate the times, just as she had dominated the style of the 80s. Things were changing, and she represented the new order. When she decided to speak to Panorama without the knowledge of the palace, divorce seemed unavoidable. But she took the opportunity to sketch out a new life and a new approach, a 1990s approach perhaps, to serving people.
I'd like to be a queen of people's hearts, in people's hearts, but I don't see myself being queen of this country.
Her relationship with Dodi Al-Fayed would certainly have caused a lot more controversy if they'd lived, if the intense media attention hadn't ended in their deaths. First, though, and now it seems almost prophetic, she stripped herself of her past. By selling her dresses, she was shedding the old life and preparing for a new one. Again, it was a gesture for the 90s. And she wasn't afraid any longer to court controversy in the campaign to get landmines banned. She used her pulling power with the media for an essentially political purpose, tied to a compassionate one. After going to Angola earlier this year, she'd won. The United States had decided to support a ban on the production and use of landmines. Altogether, the princess characterized our time. People were laying flowers outside her house today, not because everything she did was wise, but because it was all done from the heart. She was unforgettable, irreplaceable.
That's all today from the BBC Newsroom. The day that Britain lost a princess, and as John Simpson said, a young woman described by all to whom she reached out as irreplaceable. Good night.